So there was a recent document that actually apparently reveals OpenAI's secret plan to create AGI by 2027. Now, I'm going to go through this document with you page by page. I've read it over twice and there's some key things that actually did stand out to me. So without further ado, let's not waste any time. And of course, just before we get into this is of course going to contain a lot of speculation. Remember that this document isn't completely 100% factual, so just take this video with a huge grain of salt. So you can see here the document essentially says revealing OpenAI's plan to create AGI by 2027. And that is a rather important date, which we will come back to. If we look at this first thing, you can see there's an introduction, okay? And of course, remember, like I said, there's a lot of speculation in this document. There are a lot of different facts. And of course, like I said, anyone can write any document and submit it to, Twitter or Reddit or anything. But I think this document does contain a little bit more than that. So it starts out by stating that in this document, I will be revealing information I have gathered regarding OpenAI's delayed plans to create human-level AGI by 2027. Not all of it will be easily verifiable, but hopefully there's enough evidence to convince you. Summary is basically that OpenAI has started training a 125 trillion parameter multimodal model in August of 2022, and the first stage was Arrakis, also called QSTAR, and the model finished training in December of 2023, but the launch was cancelled due to the high inference cost. And before you guys think it's just a document with like just words, I'm going to show you guys later on like all of the crazy kind of stuff that is kind of verifiable that does actually line up with some of the stuff that I've seen as someone that's been paying attention to this stuff. So this is literally just the introduction. The juicier stuff does come later, but essentially they actually talk about and this is just like an overview, so you're going to want to continue watching. And they essentially state that, this is the original GPT-5, which was planned for release in 2025. Gobi GPT 4.5 has been renamed to GPT-5 because the original GPT-5 has been cancelled. Now, I gotta be honest, this paragraph here is a little bit confusing, but I do want to say that the words Arrakis and the words Gobi are definitely models that were referred to by several articles that were referring to leaks from OpenAI, and I think they were actually on the information. So this is some kind of stuff that I didn't really hear that much about, but the stuff that I did hear was pretty crazy. So this Arrakis and this Gobi thing, although you might not have heard a lot about it, of course it is like a kind of like half and half leak. But like I was saying, this stuff is kind of true. So you can see here, OpenAI dropped work on a new Arrakis model in rare AI setback. And this one actually just talks about how by the middle of OpenAI, scrapping an Arrakis launch after it didn't run as efficiently. So there's actually some references to this, but a lot of the stuff is a little bit confusing. But we're going to get on to the main part of this story now. I just wanted to include that just to show you that, these names aren't made up, because if I was watching this video for the first time and I hadn't seen some of the prior articles before, I'd be thinking, what on earth is Arrakis? What on earth is Gobi? I've only heard about QSTAR. So essentially, let's just take a look. And it says the next stage of QSTAR, originally GPT-6, but since renamed GPT-7, originally for release in 2026, has been put on hold because of the recent lawsuit by Elon Musk. If you haven't been paying attention to the space, essentially Elon Musk just filed a lawsuit, released a video yesterday, stating that OpenAI have strayed far too long from their goals, and if they are creating some really advanced technology, the public do deserve to have it open source because that was their original goal. And essentially, you can see here, it says QSTAR GPT-8 planned to be released in 2027, achieving full AGI. And one thing that I do want to say about this, because essentially they're stating that, they're doing this up to GPT-7, and then after GPT-7, they do get to AGI. One thing that I do think, okay, and I'm going to come back to this as well, is that the dates kind of do line up. And I say kind of because not like 100% because we don't know, but presuming, let's just presume, okay, because GPT-4 was released in 2023, right? Let's just say, every year release a new model, okay? That would mean that, in 2024, we would get GPT-5, in 2025, we would get GPT-6, in 2026, we would get GPT-7, and in 2027, we would get GPT-8, which is, of course, AGI. Now, one thing I do think about this that is kind of interesting, and remember, I'm going to come back to this, so pay attention, okay? What I'm basically saying is that if OpenAI are consistent with their year releases, so for example, if they are going to release a new model every year, and if we continue at the same rate, like a new GPT every single year, which is possible, him stating that GPT-7 being the last release before GPT-8, which is AGI, does actually kind of make sense. Because once again, and I know you guys are going to hate this, but if we look at the trademarks, okay, remember that they trademarked this around the same time, okay, around that 2023 time when all of this crazy stuff was going on. And I think it's important to note as well is that like there's no GPT-8. You might argue that if they're going to use all the GPT names, why wouldn't they just trademark GPT-8? And I think maybe because like the document states, the model after GPT-7 could be AGI. And I'm going to give you guys another reason on top of that. Another reason is, and I'm going to show you guys that later on in the video, but essentially, OpenAI's timeline on superalignment actually does coincide with this theory, which is a little bit coincidental. Of course, like I said, pure speculation, could be completely false. OpenAI, like I said before, can go ahead and completely change their entire plans. You know, they can go ahead and drop 2 models in 1 year. The point I'm trying to make is that certain timelines do align, but just remember this, because I'm going to come back to this because of some documents, stuff that you're going to see in this document at the end of the video. So anyways, you know, it says Elon Musk caused the delay because of his lawsuit. This while I'm revealing the information now because no further harm can be done. So I guess Elon Musk's lawsuit has kind of, you know, if you wanted, bought you some time. So he says, I've seen many definitions of AGI, artificial general intelligence, but I will define AGI simply as an artificial general intelligence that can do any intellectual task a smart human can. This is how most people define the term now. 2020 was the first time that I was shocked by an AI system. So this is just some, of course, you know, talks about his experience with, you know, AI systems. I'm guessing the person who wrote this, but, you know, AGI, if you don't know, AGI is like an AI system that can do any task human can. But one thing that is important to discern is that, you know, AGI, there was a recent paper that actually talks about the levels of AGI. And I think it's important to remember that AGI isn't just, you know, one AI that can do absolutely everything. There are going to be levels to this AGI system that we've seen so far. And in this paper, Levels of AGI, they actually talk about how, you know, we're already at emerging AGI, which is, you know, emerging, which is equal or somewhat better than an unskilled human. So we are at level 1 AGI. And then, of course, we've got, you know, competent AGI, which is going to be at least 50% of the 50th percentile of skilled adults. And that's competent AGI, that's not yet achieved. And then, of course, we've got expert AGI, which is 90th percentile of skilled adults, which is not yet achieved. And then we've got virtuoso AGI, which is not yet achieved, which is 99th percentile of all skilled adults. And then we've got artificial super intelligence, which is just 100%. So I think it's important to understand that there are these levels to AGI, because once someone says AGI, I mean, is it 99? Can it do like half? You know, it's like, it's just pretty confusing. But I think this is a really good framework for actually looking at the definition, because trust me, it's an industry standard, but it is very, very confusing. So here's where he basically says that, you know, GPT 3.5, which powered the famous ChatGPT, and of course GPT-3, which was not the successor, but the predecessor of 3.5. It says, you know, these were a massive step forward towards AGI, but the note is, you know, GPT-2 and all chatbots since Eliza had no real ability to respond coherently, so while such GPT-3 a massive leap. And then, of course, this is where we talk about parameter count, and of course he says deep learning is a concept that essentially goes back to the beginning of AI research in the 1950s. First neural network was created in the 50s, yada, yada, yada. So basically, this is where he's giving the description of a parameter, and he says, you may already know, but to give a brief digestible summary, it's analogous to a synapse in a biological brain, which is a connection between neurons, and each neuron in a biological brain has roughly 1,000 connections to other neurons. Obviously, digital networks are actually analogous to biological brains, basically saying that, you know, of course we're comparing them, but different. But how many synapses or parameters are in a human brain? The most commonly cited figure for synapse count in the brain is roughly 100 trillion, which would mean each neuron is 100 billion in the human brain, has roughly 1,000 connections. And remember, this number 100 trillion, because it's gonna actually be a very, very big number that you do need to remember. So of course you can see here the human brain consists of 100 billion neurons and over 100 trillion synaptic connections. Okay, and essentially this is trying to, you know, just pair the similarities between parameters and synapses, essentially stating here that, you know, if each neuron in a brain, and trust me guys, this is just all gonna come into everything. Like, I know you guys might be thinking, what is the point of talking about this? I just want to hear about QSTAR, but just trust me, all of this stuff, it does actually make sense. Like, I've read this a lot of times, so I'm going to skip some pages, but the pages I'm talking about now, just trust me guys, you're going to want to read them. And it basically says here, if each neuron in a brain has 1,000 connections, this means the cat has roughly 250 billion synapses, and a dog has roughly 530 billion synapses. Synapse count generally seems to predict higher intelligence, with a few exceptions. For instance, elephants technically have a higher synapse count than humans, but yet display lower intelligence. Of course, basically, here's where he's actually talking about how, you know, the simplest explanation for larger synapse counts with lower intelligence is a smaller amount of quality data. And from an evolutionary perspective, brains are quote unquote trained on billions of years of epigenetic data, and human brains evolved from higher quality socialization, communication data than elephants, leading to our superior ability to reason. But the point he's trying to make here is that, you know, while there are nuances that, you know, don't make sense, synapse count is definitely important. And I think we've definitely seen that with the similarities in the parameter size with the explosion of LLMs and what we've seen in these multimodal models and their capabilities. And it says, again, the explosion in AI capabilities since the early 2010s has been a result of far more computing power and far more data. GPT GPT-2 had 1.5 billion connections, which is less than a mouse's brain, and GPT-3 had 175 billion connections, which is again somewhat closer to a cat's brain. And obviously, it's intuitively obvious that an AI system the size of a cat's brain would be superior to a system than the size of a mouse's brain. So here's where things start to get interesting. So he says, in 2020, after the release of the 175 billion parameter GPT-3, many speculated about the potential performance of a model 600 times larger at 100 trillion parameters. Just remember this number, because this number is about to just keep, repeating in your head. And of course, he says the big question is it possible to predict AI performance by parameter count? And as it turns out, the answer is yes, as you'll see on the next page. And this is where he actually references this article, which is called Extrapolating GPT End Performance by Lanrian. And it was an article written in 2022. And basically, it talks about how as you scale up in parameter count, you approach optimal performance. So essentially, this graph seems to be illustrating the relationship between neural networks measured by the number of parameters, which can be thought of as the strength of connections between neurons and their performance on various tasks. And these tasks included language-related challenges like translation, reading comprehension, and question and answering, among others. And the performance on these tasks is measured in the vertical axis, higher values indicating better performance. And the graph shows that as the number of parameters increases, the performance on these tasks also tends to, but of course it does have diminishing returns as you move right, because the curves actually do tend to plateau as they reach the higher parameter counts. And of course, the various colors on this chart just essentially represent different tasks, and each dot on those lines represents a neural network model of a certain size and certain parameter count being tested on that. You can see right down here, this is where the trained GPT, you can see the GPT-3 performance. So it says flop usage train at GPT-3. And then, of course, you can see right here, this is apparently the number of synapses in the brain. And just remember the number 100 trillion or 200 trillion, because it's going to be really important. So it then says, as Lanrian illustrated, extrapolations show that AI performance inexplicably seems to reach human level at the same time as a human level brain size is matched with the parameter count. His count for the synapse in the brain is roughly 200 trillion parameters, as opposed to the commonly cited 100 trillion figure. But the point still stands, 100 trillion parameters is remarkably close to optimal. By the way, an important thing to note is that although 100 trillion is slightly suboptimal in performance, there is an engineering technique that OpenAI is using to bridge this gap. And I'll explain this towards the very end of this document, because it is crucial to what OpenAI is building. And Lanrian's post is one of many similar posts online. It's an extrapolation of performance based on the jump between previous models. And OpenAI certainly has much more detailed metrics, and they've come to the same conclusion as Lanrian, as I'll show later in this document. So, if AI performance is predictable based on parameter count and 100 trillion parameters is enough for human level performance, when will a 100 trillion parameter AI model be released in the future? So here's where we go, okay? It says that GPT-5 achieved proto AGI in late 2023 with an IQ of 48. Now that is a statement that, with the IQ of 48, I genuinely don't know where that's coming from. I'm guessing that's maybe just based on predictions and stuff like that, but I genuinely don't know where this, like, in the beginning, there was this, IQ thing where it was like, IQ 48, IQ 96, delay. I genuinely don't know where those IQ values are coming from. It doesn't really state in this document unless I missed it somewhere. But essentially, this is a point where things start to get super interesting, because this is where he's referencing a whole bunch of sources. But it says that, of course, Jimmy Apples did tweet AGI has been achieved internally. If you didn't watch the video that I made on AGI has been achieved internally, Jimmy Apples wasn't the only one that tweeted this. Sam Altman actually himself did actually post this on Reddit, and then he edited the comment to say, look, we were just joking around. And of course, this is a guy who runs Runway. He said that I have been told that GPT-5 is scheduled to complete training this December, and that OpenAI expects it to achieve AGI, which means we will hotly debate whether or not it actually will achieve AGI, which means it will. And of course, you can see this guy is CEO of Runway and a bunch of other companies. And it's actually, funnily enough, he actually is followed by Sam Altman. So this statement actually wasn't like, there weren't many detractors of the statement, which was quite interesting considering that that's just a bold statement about GPT-5. But nonetheless, it was a very interesting statement. Anyways, we continue on in this document, and it states the first mention of a 100 trillion parameter model being developed by OpenAI was in the summer of 2021. Mentioned offhand in a Wired interview by the CEO of Ceberas, Andrew Feldman, a company which is Sam Altman is a major investor of. And if you don't know what the Ceberas company does, they produce crazy clusters. And you can see right here that they have the fastest HPC accelerator on Earth. You can see that the latest GPU theirs is pretty insane. And I'm guessing that they're looking to deploy these in the future. based on future AI systems. Essentially, this basically talks about the first mention of an 100 trillion parameter model being deployed was in the summer of 2021, and you can see that it's mentioned in an offhand wired interview by the CEO of Ceberas, like I just talked about, which Sam Altman is a major investor of. This is actually pretty true. Sam Altman actually has invested, I think it's between 50 million to 80 million. And I think OpenAI has actually agreed to purchase some of the chips, some kind of deal. But it says from talking to OpenAI, GPT-4 will be about 100 trillion parameters. That won't be ready for several years. And remember, this was, of course, debunked if you were in the space at that time, if you were actually paying attention to things. But anyways, if we continue, okay, because I want to get through some of this stuff, it says Sam Altman's response to Andrew Feldman at an online meetup at AC10. It's crucial to note that Sam Altman admits to their plans for a 100 trillion parameter model. So this is essentially an excerpt from that blog post / interview, and it says GPT-4 is coming, but the current focus is on the codex and also where the available compute is coming. GPT-4 will be a text model as opposed to multimodal. And it says, okay, this is where things get interesting, okay? Pay attention to this. It says 100 trillion parameter model won't be GPT-4 and is far off. They're getting much more performance out of smaller models. Maybe they may never need such a big model. And then it says it's not yet obvious how to train a model to do stuff on the internet and think long on very difficult problems. And a lot of work is going to make it accurate and tell the truth. So basically this part is to look at the early stages where Sam Altman is basically stating that, you know, they do have plans for an 100 trillion parameter model, which is essentially this brain-like AGI type system. Now, here's where we talk about some more leaks. And of course, things are very speculative. So of course, like I said, it could be just pure speculation, but it says an AI researcher, Igor, made the claim a few weeks later that GPT-4 was being trained and would be released between December and February. Again, I will prove that he really did have accurate information as a credible source. This will be important soon. So you can see here, he tweets that OpenAI started to train GPT-4, release is planned for December/Feb. Then, essentially, Gwern, a famous figure in the AI world, he's an AI researcher and blogger, he messaged Igor Baikov on Twitter in September 2022, and this is the response he received. It's important to remember the colossal number of parameters, text, audio, images, possibly video, and multimodal, and this comes from a subreddit called This Is The Way It Will Be, which is a private small subreddit run by mathematicians with an interest in AGI and a few AI enthusiasts. And it says they use this subreddit to discuss topics deeper than what you'll find in the mainstream. And you can see here that he actually does talk about how OpenAI started training GPT-4 and the training will be completed in a couple months. And trust me, guys, I'm going to get to the big bit. But essentially, this is someone who had early information on this model, okay? And essentially, a colossal number of parameters. It sounds like this guy was referencing a 100 trillion parameter model, as 500 billion parameter models and 1 trillion parameter models had already been trained many times by the time of this tweet in summer 2022, making models of that size unexceptional and certainly not colossal. So these tweets from, I'm just going to say Rapu, because they actually do make a similar claim, which is pretty interesting, okay? So this is where stuff gets even more interesting, okay? Because this guy, okay, just call him Rapu because I don't know how to say RXPU time, but he says he also mentions an 125 trillion synapse. GPT-4, however, incorrectly states the GPT-3's parameter count as 1 trillion. But essentially, he states that, you know, it was far behind the human brain, containing 100 trillion synapses. But what he did get right was stating that it will be introduced to the public at the beginning of 2023 and is able to write academic theses and articles that human intelligence cannot distinguish. So this is another person that did have earlier inside information. Now, he does cite that this is a weaker piece of evidence because Rune is a fairly notable Silicon Valley AI researcher, followed by CEO Sam Altman, and he did tweet at Rune, I'm guessing, is GPT-4 100 trillion parameters are rumored, and then the guy thumbs it up. I'm not really sure what that is referring to that much, but essentially the information from the previous two people who had early information about GPT-4 were then basically sent to this person, okay? It says, in November 2022, I reached out to an AI blogger named Alberto, and his post seemed to spread pretty far online, so I was hoping that I sent him some basic GPT-4, he might be able to do a write-up. So you can see they were actually talking, and he said, of course, the info necessary isn't official, but this is all important, just trust me, because essentially later on in this document, you'll see how the 100 trillion parameter model being talked about now is something that's been in the works for a while, and there are a few things that do make sense. So you can see here that, of course, Alberto then goes ahead to publish this, where this rumor does start to spread, and you can see that then the 100 trillion parameter leak went viral, reaching millions of people to the point that OpenAI's employees, including CEO Sam Altman, had to respond, calling it complete foolishness, called it factually incorrect. And of course, this guy, of course, did claim responsibility for the leak, because if you remember at this time, this was a really, really huge deal, where people were stating that this is going to be really, really huge. But this isn't the caveat. It's not about them not getting this wrong. It's about the fact that GPT-4 is not going to be 100 trillion parameters. It's about that this document is basically stating that in the future, GPT-8, whatever model it's going to be, the one that achieves AGI will actually have this count. And these guys knew this from quite some time ago. That's why we're essentially looking at this kind of data in terms of the leaks and stuff to kind of show you guys how we actually got there. So remember this Igor guy, he was also stating that he also heard about 100 trillion parameters, but he found that this was going to be ridiculous, so he decided not to include it with his tweet about GPT-4, because when he heard 100 trillion parameters, he was like, wait, that doesn't make sense for GPT-4, because why would it be that much bigger than GPT-3? Like, it doesn't make sense. And then you can see this is where you start to talk about, 2022, where I became convinced that OpenAI planned to release a 1 to 2 trillion parameter subset of GPT-4 before releasing the full 100 trillion parameter model GPT-5. So basically, all of these people said the same thing. All of these people who were early on GPT-4 somehow, I'm not entirely sure, stated that this was all going to be a model in the future that would have 125 trillion parameters or over 100 trillion parameters. And essentially bringing it back to Igor's leak, you can see that there were a couple of people that were also using a beta version of GPT-4. Now, of course, it says the sources here are varying credibility, but they all inexplicitly say the same thing. GPT-4 was being tested in October/November of 2022, and according to the US military AI researcher, it was definitely being trained in October, which again lines up with Igor's leak. Now, essentially what's crazy here is that it says OpenAI's official position, as demonstrated by Sam Altman itself, is that the idea of a 100 trillion parameter GPT-4 is complete false. This is a half true because GPT-4 is a 100 trillion parameter subset of the full 100 trillion parameter model. I'm not sure if I do believe that statement, because one of the problems is that of course GPT-4 isn't actually confirmed, but according to some articles, it has been confirmed that GPT-4 does have at least 1 trillion parameters. I mean, some people have said that is 1.8. I mean, some people said it's 1.2. But here's where one of the leaks that I do remember, and this is one of the first videos I did make on GPT-4, and it was because the CTO of Microsoft Germany, a week prior to the official release of GPT-4, actually did slip up and reveal that there exists a GPT-4, which does have the ability to process videos. And it says, I imagine he was unaware of OpenAI's decision not to reveal the video capabilities of the system. And this completely proves that GPT-4/5 was trained on not just text and images, but also video data. And of course, we can infer that audio data was included as well. So he says, we will introduce GPT-4 next week. I remember I actually made this video. If you go back to the channel, you can actually see this. And he says, we will introduce GPT-4 next week. They will have multimodal models that will offer completely different possibilities. For example, videos. And he said the CTO called the LLM a game changer because they teach machines to understand natural language, which then understand in a statistical way what was previously only readable and understandable by humans. In the meantime, the technology has come so far that it basically works in all language. You can ask a question in German and get an answer in Italian. And remember, this was actually a very, very credible statement because it was the CTO of Microsoft, and we did actually get GPT-4 a week later. And the point again is that Igor before said that GPT-4 was going to be released in January/February, and this kind of claim was also corroborated by a credible entrepreneur who stated that in October 2022, GPT-4's release date would be between January and February 2023. Now, some people are stating, well, GPT-4 was released in March, but of course you can see right here, although GPT-4 was released in March 2023, slightly outside the window, I think it was done intentionally by OpenAI to discredit the leak. And I can't lie, I actually do agree with that because I've seen some stuff, tweeted by people like Jimmy Apples and stuff like that. And I'm pretty sure sometimes when leaks have gotten pretty big, OpenAI have decided against it because it just discredits the leakers. And I mean, they're working on some top secret stuff here. Now, here's where we get into the AGI debate. It says, a note about robotics. AI researchers are beginning to believe that vision is all that's necessary for optimal real world/physical performance. And in order to give one example, Tesla completely ditched all sensors and fully committed to vision for their self-driving cars. The point is that training a human-sized AI model on all the image and video data on the internet will clearly be more than enough to handle complex robotic tasks. So that common sense reasoning is buried in the video data, and just like it's buried in the text data, and the text-focused GPT-4 is stunningly good at common sense reasoning. And it does actually show an example of where, Tesla actually does remove its ultrasonic sensors. And then I'm going to show you another slide where Tesla actually do talk about how image is all they need / video. And you can see the former head of Tesla AI where explains they removed the sensors while others differ. That's Andrej Karpathy, I believe. And this was another example, if you remember at the time, and this is all going to tie in, so just pay attention. Essentially, Palm E, if you do remember this video from around 2023, where essentially it was AI system that learned mainly from vision combined with a large language model, and there were minimal robotics data required on top of the language and vision training. And Palm E was a 500 billion parameter model, and it asks the question that what happens when robotics is trained on an 100 trillion parameter model on all the data available on the internet. And this was a pretty crazy system, I'm not gonna lie to you guys. Like, looking at Palm E, at how good it was definitely a very, very comprehensive system that could do a lot of stuff. I remember it was able to deal with adversarial disturbances. It was able to, get stuff that you wanted it to do. This was a pretty good system. They did upgrade this, but I'm surprised they haven't dropped any updates recently because it was a really good system for the time. And of course, this is where they talk about the Tesla update, where it says, Optimus performed, its first end-to-end learned successful graph today. You can see it below at 1x speed. This was learned from human demonstrations. No specific task programming was done. This means we can now scale quickly to many tasks. It says, join us before it's late, make the AI happen with us. It says, if human demonstrations are all that's needed for advanced robotics performance, an 100 trillion parameter model trained on all the web would certainly be able to achieve astonishing robotics performance. And I wonder what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, because I'm not too clued up on robotics and how entirely that is to train, but I do know that next week, or in fact 2 to 3 weeks from now, we're going to have a huge robotics announcement where they're basically, want someone at one of the leading robotics companies. They actually did state that we thought we didn't have the data, but now we do, and that they've made a breakthrough. So I wouldn't be surprised if soon we do get a real update, because someone said that 3 weeks from now, someone at mine said, there's going to be a huge update that's going to completely change robotics. So before you actually, discredit this area, I would say give it like 3 weeks, because we don't know. Now, essentially it says the image on the left shows what a trillion parameter GPT-4 is capable of in image recognition, which is pretty crazy. If you haven't seen this demo before, this was in the GPT-4 paper where they talked about how good this model is at understanding things, and it's already clearer and written more well than many humans would have been able to come up with. So it says, so again, what happens when you train a model 100 times larger than GPT-4, which is the actual size of the human brain, on all the data available on the internet? And then we get to this slide where it says, important, notice how the AI model is able to generate multiple angles of the same scene with physically accurate lighting, and in even some cases, physically accurate fluid and rain. And if you can generate images and videos with accurate common sense physics, you have common sense reasoning. And if you can generate common sense, you understand common sense. And I mean, this is once again one of those points where it's delving into the argument of, if an AI system can accurately do lighting, if it can understand, physics and rain and all that kind of stuff. This is Meta's video thing. It's basically saying that, does the AI have a common sense world model in its head where it can truly understand how the world, is, and how it interacts, and how, like what kind of reasoning does it use in its head to be able to get this okay? And some people say that, some people say these AI systems just pattern recognition, it's just regenerating stuff, it's seen in its training data, but some argue that it's able to completely understand the physical world that we live in, and it's got some kind of world model, it's got some kind of common sense thinking algorithm, whichever way you want to put it, so that it can completely get this stuff correctly, because it needs to be able to if it wants to. And I mean, that's something, again, that is really debated. Now here it gives us some talks about someone that did give the early leaks for GPT-4 again. And what's crazy is that they do talk about image and audio generation would be trained in Q3 of 2023. And apparently, if video generation training is simulation simultaneous or shortly after, this actually does line up with Chen's claim of GPT-5 being finished training in December of 2023. So remember that guy before, the CEO of Runway, stating that GPT-5 would be finished training in December, was now around 3 months ago. That actually does line up with some of the claims made here. And this is also someone that did have early inside access. So we can see clearly that there are people that do have inside access. Now, here's where we get into the crazy bit, because this is where we talk about long-term planning, and of course things do change, but I think this is going to be the most important part of the video. But it says here that OpenAI president Greg Brockman stated that in 2019, following a $1 billion investment from Microsoft at the time, OpenAI planned to build a human brain-sized model within 5 years, and that was their plan on how to achieve AGI. Remember that bit, guys. OpenAI planned to build a human-sized brain model within 5 years, and that was their plan for how to achieve AGI. You can see, within 5 years and possibly much faster, with the aim of building a system that can run a human-sized brain model. And of course, that's why I said before, the same number, 100 trillion parameters, is the reason that number is being cited a lot. And that's why I'm guessing if OpenAI had previously stated in 2019 that their investments from Microsoft would actually help them to try and build a human-sized brain within 5 years, leaks about 100 trillion going viral and then it's spreading about GPT-4 could actually be the reason that actually occurred, because many people were confused thinking GPT-4 is going to have 100 trillion, but many people didn't realize that this is actually the future models, which is what OpenAI have been planning all along. And I think that actually does make sense. Like, if we can actually corroborate statements and understand what's actually being said from actual OpenAI employees, I think those are the best chances we do have at looking at what is realistic. You can see here, it says both of these sources are clearly referring to the same plan to achieve AGI, a human brain-sized AI model trained on images, text, and other data due to be trained within 5 years of 2019, so by 2024, and it seems to line up with all the other sources I've listed in this document. So essentially, that's what Greg Brockman did state, which is a pretty hefty piece of information. And yeah, that would actually line up with 2024. And this is where we start to get into the part where certain people start to urge caution on AI. And this is the part where he starts to argue that, suddenly AI leaders are starting to sound the alarm, almost like they know something very specific that the general public doesn't. And I would argue that yes, that is kind of true, but AI leaders have been stating this from ages ago. Like Sam Altman has been stating since 2015 that AI is dangerous, and Elon Musk has been stating the same thing. But I would argue as well that certain people from Google did actually leave recently. And we're going to get into that now. They actually did leave fairly recently, and I'm not surprised, but they actually did really leave recently, and maybe it's just coincidence. I'm part of it, but it says, in this uncertain climate that Hassabis agrees to a rare interview, they should start warning about his growing concerns. I would advocate not moving fast and breaking things, he says, referring to an old Facebook motto. And essentially their old motto was, release technologies into the world first and then fix any problems that arose later. And of course, you can't do that with super intelligence. And he says AI is now on the cusp of being able to make tools that could be damaging, urging his competitors to proceed with caution than ever before. And of course, Geoffrey Hinton, if you don't know this guy, by industry standards, the godfather of AI, confirmed that he actually did leave Google in 2023 because he wanted to actually talk about the dangers of AI. He said the idea that this stuff could actually get smarter than the people. A few people believe that, Hinton said in the interview, but most people thought it was way off, and I thought it was way off. I thought it was 30 to 50 years away or even longer. Obviously, I no longer think that, and he thinks superintelligence is coming far quicker than we did think. Now, if you remember as well, this is very fascinating because at the time, this was something that was pretty crazy. It says shortly after the release of GPT-4, the Future of Life Institute, a highly influential non-profit organization concerned with mitigating the potential catastrophic risks to the world, released an open letter on all AI labs to pause AI development for 6 months. Why? Because they essentially stated that, including the currently being trained GPT-5, and this is kind of crazy. I didn't actually see that. Okay, it says, we call on all AI labs to immediately pause training systems more powerful than GPT-4, including the currently being trained GPT-5. Signatories include, all of these people that we like, Elon Musk, that even worked at Apple. And apparently, the first release version of the letter specifically said, including the currently being trained GPT-5, and then apparently it was removed, which is pretty crazy. And then, of course, there is a quote from Sam Altman, like I said again, and this is pretty crazy because he says, do we have enough information on the internet to create AGI? And Sam Altman's blunt, immediate response, interrupting the man asking the question, is yes. He elaborates, yes, we're confident there is. We think about this and we measure it quite a lot.
Information in the internet to create AGI. So if you contrast it with the
Yes.
we have a continuous video feed to our eyes, and on the internet, we only have like a subset of that.
Yeah, we're confident there is. We think about this and measure it quite a lot.
What gives you that confidence? Is it the size of the knowledge base? Is it complexity? Is it some?
One of the things that I think OpenAI has driven in the field is that's been really healthy is that you can treat scaling laws as a scientific prediction. You can do this for compute, you can do this for data, but you can measure at small scale and you can predict quite accurately how it's going to scale up, how much data you're going to need, how much compute you're going to need, how many parameters you're going to need. When the generated data gets like good enough to be helpful. The internet is like, there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of video out there too.
A few more questions, maybe?
So, you did see from that clip how Sam Altman actually did talk about it. He seems very confident on that prediction in order to get to AGI, the kind of data that they do need. And then here's what he says on Sam Altman's Q&A. He says that, first of all, he seems highly confident that it exists enough data on an AGI system, confident to the point that it makes one question if they've already done it or in the process of doing it, which is definitely a bold statement to state that they've, basically done it in 2022. In fact, that interview was actually from the early stages of 23, which is quite fascinating. But then again, GPT-4 did finish training at that time, so they would definitely be working on other AI systems at that point. Now, essentially what he talks about here is that, and I think this is, probably the thing that you should probably take away from this video. And it says, as I mentioned earlier in the document, an 100 trillion parameter model is actually slightly suboptimal, but there is a new scaling paradigm OpenAI is using to bridge this gap, and it's based on something called the Chinchilla scaling laws. Chinchilla was an AI model unveiled by Deepmind in early 2022, and the implication of the Chinchilla research paper was that current models are significantly trained, and with far more compute, meaning more data, we would see a massive boost in performance, the need to increase parameters. The point is that while an untrained or undertrained 100 trillion parameter model may be slightly suboptimal, if it were trained on vastly more data, it would be able to exceed human level performance. And the Chinchilla paradigm is widely understood and accepted in the field of machine learning. But just to give a specific example from OpenAI, President Greg Brockman discusses this in an interview on how OpenAI realized their initial scaling laws were flawed and have since adjusted to take the chinchilla laws into account.
Calculations to figure out, like, hey, how big of a model do you think you're going to need? Lots of mistakes, for sure. Like a good example of this is the scaling laws. So we did this study to actually start to really scientifically understand how do models improve as you push on various axes. So as you pour more compute in, as you pour more data in. And one conclusion that we had at one point was that basically that there's sort of a limited amount of data that you want to pour into these models, and that there's kind of this very clear curve. And that one thing that we realized only years later was actually that we'd read the curves a little bit wrong, and that you actually want to be training for way more tokens, way more data than anyone had expected. And that there's definitely these moments where these things that just didn't quite click, where it's like it just didn't add up, that we were training for so little, and that some of the conclusions that you drew downstream. But then you realize there was a foundational assumption that was wrong, and suddenly things make way more sense. So I think it's a little bit like physics in some sense, where like, do you doubt physics? It's like, I kind of do. I think all of physics is wrong, right? But like, only so wrong, right? It's like we clearly haven't reconciled like quantum and relativity, so there's like something wrong there. But that wrongness is actually an opportunity. It's actually a sign of you have this thing that's already useful, right? It really like has affected our lives, and it's actually like pretty great. I'm very happy with what physics has done, but also there's fruit. And so I think that for me, that's always been the feeling, that there's something here, and that if we do keep pushing and somehow the scaling laws all peter out, right, and they suddenly drop off a cliff and we can't make any further progress, like that would be the most exciting time in this field, because we would have finally reached the limit of technology, we would have finally learned something, and then we would finally have a picture of what the next thing to do is.
And yeah, you can clearly see that Greg Brockman discusses how their initial scaling laws were flawed. And of course, a lot of people were stating at this time that training a compute optimal 100 trillion parameter model would have cost billions of dollars and just isn't feasible. Well, Microsoft invested $10 billion into OpenAI in early 2023, so I guess it isn't that ridiculous of a possibility after all. The only question I do have, but then again, I don't really have that question anymore after reading the lawsuit from yesterday, was that, of course, Microsoft does get access to only pre-AGI tech, but then again, OpenAI is the one that gets to determine whether the technology is AGI or not. Part of me even wonders if, Microsoft will even exist, or even some of these companies once AGI exists, because, AGI could potentially make competition irrelevant. That's another question for another video. But essentially, Alberto Romero wrote about Deepmind's Chinchilla scaling breakthrough, and Chinchilla showed us that despite being vastly smaller than GPT-3 and Deepmind's own Gopher, it outperformed them as a result of being trained vastly on more data. Just to reiterate this one more time, although a 100 trillion model is predicted to achieve slightly suboptimal performance, OpenAI is well aware of the Chinchilla scaling laws, as is pretty much everyone in the AI field, and as they are training QSTAR as a 100 trillion parameter model that is compute optimal and trained on far more data than they really intended, they have the funds to do it now through Microsoft, and this will result in a model that is far exceeds the performance of what they had initially planned for their 100 trillion parameter model. And 100 trillion parameters without the Chinchilla scaling laws equal roughly human level, but slightly suboptimal. But 100 trillion parameters multimodal with Chinchilla scaling laws taken into account, what on earth do we get? And I think I'm not that clued up on the Chinchilla scaling laws, if I'm being completely honest. I wasn't aware of this, but what I do know is that if this statement is true, and if the research is up to date, because I do know that AI research is a very complex field and it is a very dynamic field, and research papers every single day will be changing how future systems are trained. And maybe there's a research paper that was released, just 20 minutes ago or something. There are literally like 160 papers released every single day, which is absolutely insane. But this is a true fact that there are so many research papers released every single day. The AI space isn't dynamic enough, and these Chinchilla scaling laws are true. And if they do now have the funds to actually train something that is going to be an 100 trillion parameter model, I'm guessing that this might have been what potentially sparked that letter, that kind of breakthrough that, I guess you could say got Sam Altman fired. And I'm guessing that maybe something like this was potentially the ignition to spark a lot of stress at OpenAI, because they actually did state, Sam Altman in an interview said, look, everyone at OpenAI is stressed because we're building superintelligence. I actually made a video on that because I was like, that's a crazy statement to say. And of course, around that time, there was so much drama. And around that time, they did, trademark the models. And of course, trademarks could absolutely nothing. But I just find that, everything happening around that time, I just don't think that that's a coincidence. Now, what is crazy as well is this is where they actually do talk about superalignment. It says our goal is to build roughly human level automated alignment researcher. We can then use vast amounts of compute to scale our efforts. And of course, OpenAI has planned to build human level AI by 2027 and then scale up to super intelligence. And this has been delayed because Elon Musk's lawsuit be coming up but shortly. And essentially he does talk about this, and I don't think this is that crazy. Essentially this guy is an OpenAI researcher who worked there in the summer of 2022. He joined there for 1 year. I'm not sure he works there anymore, but essentially he wrote a letter to himself, and essentially he said that, the company he's working on, and this is the kind of note that he wrote to himself. He said there's an AI company building an AI that fills giant rooms, eats a town's worth of electricity, and has recently gained an astounding ability to converse like people. It can write essays or poetry on any topic. It can ace college level exams. It's daily gaining new capabilities that engineers who tend to the AI can't even talk about in public yet. Those engineers do, however, sit in the cafeteria and debate the meaning of what they're creating. What will it learn to do next week? Which jobs might render it obsolete? Should they slow down or stop so as to not tickle the tail end of the dragon? But wouldn't that mean that someone else, probably someone with less scruples, would wake the dragon first? Is there an ethical obligation to tell the world about this? Is there an obligation to tell it less? You are spending a year working at my job, well, your job, to develop the mathematical theory on how to prevent the AI and its successors from where that essentially means destroying the world. And essentially he's referring to the QSTAR multimodal 125 trillion parameter beast. So essentially, this document basically just tries to say that, look, every year we're going to get a GPT update till 2027. And the reason 2027 is the date is because that actually does coincide with OpenAI's deadline to create superalignment. And they actually state that they want to do this within 4 years. And since it was 2023 when they said this, if they do manage to get superalignment done within 4 years, that would be 2027. And considering they trademarked all the way up to GPT-7. That would mean that if a new GPT model is released every single year, accounting for GPT-5, GPT-6, and GPT-7, considering that's 3 more years, that takes us exactly to 2027 when superalignment should be done. And then once we have, I guess you could say the system that will solve superalignment and we can actually solve that, then they can actually safely realize that, look, we can safely train an AGI level system or this 125 trillion parameter model, QSTAR, whatever it is, because then it would actually be safe to do so. So I'm guessing that kind of does make sense with the iterative deployment that we did see before. I'm guessing that, if I'm being honest with you guys, maybe I did miss some key things in this document. Maybe there's some stuff that I'm going to miss, but I do think that certain things do make sense. Like if they are iteratively deploying things, that does mean that, we're not going to get everything that they do have. They could have literally, crazy models. And do remember that Sam Altman, in that interview, he did actually talk about how they're able to predict the capabilities of future models by training in a system which is much less compute intensive. And if you remember, this was something that I did retweet and this was something that I did talk about. And I'm guessing that whatever breakthrough that they had with, whether it was QSTAR, whether they realized they just need a lot more compute, I think the elephant in the room is that over the next couple of years, we're going to get iteratively better systems, which OpenAI are going to release well after they've trained the models, because they stated that the society needs time to adapt. If you looked at the Sora paper, they did state, one of their employees in a deleted tweet stated that, we're going to release that just to make sure that people can reassess their timelines on what AI's capabilities are. So I'm guessing that they just wanted to release that to tell us what's capable. But the point is that they know where these AI systems are going to go because they have predictable scaling and they've accurately predicted GPT-4's capability. And I'm guessing if they've accurately predicted all the way the capabilities to GPT-5, 6, and 7, even though during that time things could really change because AI's development field is so rapid, I do think that some of this stuff kind of does make sense considering the fact that they want superalignment solved in the next 4 years, and that would align with 2027 when, if we're continuing on the release of a new LLM model or multimodal AI system each year, which is what they've already trademarked, it kind of would make sense that we do get an AGI system at that level. One question I do have is, what does Sam need the 7 trillion for, which is already, we know, to be likely the AGI type system. And I'm guessing that if we're going to train something that's potentially, of course, really compute intensive, at first I was thinking that something compute as intensive as GPT-4, which was really compute intensive, which is why they don't even give us the message cap. But with these chinchilla laws now being 4 times less, I still think that they're going to need a ridiculous amount of compute because, of course, there is that compute overhang, which Sam Altman talked about, which essentially just means that there isn't enough GPU to go around. There isn't enough to actually provide the compute. But I'm guessing that with the 7 trillion whatever Sam Altman has talked about in these private interviews, whatever he's going to be, pitching to these investors, I'm guessing that potentially this could work. Now, some of the caveats that I do have about this is that, of course, some of the information is just unverifiable. Like you're not really able to verify some of this stuff. But I think from this, what we can take is that they probably do know where AGI is in terms of being able to predict the capabilities. And based on the statements that they have said, it does look like we could be getting a model that is going to be a larger increase in parameter count, because it does seem to be something that OpenAI did state. And they did previously state that they were going to build something that does have the same amount of size as a human brain. However, there were some caveats to this, because recently Google's AI boss actually did say that scale only gets you so far. But then again, Sam Altman is trying to raise $7 trillion. So I'm guessing that maybe if scale isn't what gets you so far, Sam Altman wouldn't be trying to raise $7 trillion if they could just do it with the compute that they did have at hand. So I'm guessing that they do need scale, because they've already predicted it with less compute. And I'm just going to leave with that. But let me know what you guys thought about this. This wasn't meant to be that long, but I did want to cover absolutely everything. And I just wanted to make this information available to you. I don't know whether or not this is all going to be possible. Like I said, OpenAI could go out and they could change everything. But the truth is, regardless of all of this interesting information and regardless of all of this speculation, the only people that know what's going on is OpenAI and the people that work there. But let me know what you guys think about this. Do you think this is going to be there? Do you think this information is completely false? Do you think this guy's got it completely wrong? Do you think he's got it completely right? I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below.